Good afternoon, folks. Glad you could join us. We are going to give it a couple minutes to let our colleagues come in from the waiting room. We'll get started in just a minute. All right. A few more folks are trickling in. We will officially kick it off in just a minute. Okay. On the East Coast, it is 3:01, and we've got a couple dozen folks, so I think we're going to get started. I'm sure other people will join us as we go. So good afternoon and welcome back from Labor Day. Thanks for joining us for the Comprehensive Electricity Planning in an Era of Load Growth virtual learning session for September, right at the top of the month. As you may recall, this is the third in our series about modeling assumptions, training, and staff support for different kinds of planning. So we talked about distribution system planning in July with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. In August, we talked about transmission planning, models and assumptions. And now today we're coming around to IRP, Integrated Resource Planning, models, assumptions, and training opportunities. Have a fantastic set of speakers for you. Kirsten will introduce them momentarily. We are recording the session today, and we will provide the PowerPoint slides and the recording afterwards. Those will be posted to the Comprehensive Planning website, and we'll put the link in the chat again for you also. Next slide, please, Jessica. As you probably recall, we will have 15-minute presentations, 10 minutes of Q&A for each of our expert speakers, and then we will go into our breakout rooms where we get the chance to find out what are some things that are standing in your way of making progress in your state. Where are you stuck? What are your next steps? And we can tap into our experts and your peers across the country to hopefully give you some ideas for where you can go from here. So be thinking about those topics as we go through the presentations. Also, we will do Q&A after each speaker, so you can type those questions in the chat at any time, or you can wait and raise your hand virtually. Our next session will be the first week in October, I guess technically the second week in October, the first Tuesday. And we will get back to you soon about how we will be pulling things all together for that presentation. Most importantly, though, please pull out your calendars. We are going to finally have the opportunity to get together in person. There will be a highly interactive, very collaborative workshop in person over the dates of December 9th to 11th. It'll be the afternoon of the 9th, all day on the 10th, and the morning on the 11th in Washington, D.C., or very close by. There will be travel stipends provided, so your travel can be reimbursed by either NARUC or NASEO, depending on what membership you're a part of. And we're going to make a lot of progress at those sessions. We'll provide a draft agenda very soon. Please save the dates for now, and we will get a lot more information to you in follow-up and over email. So with that, I'm going to give Kirsten the opportunity to introduce our experts for today, and we are going to jump into things.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. And it's good to see everybody again. Happy fall. I wanted to just quickly introduce our experts for today. So we'll have two sessions, as Danielle indicated. The first one will be with Nikhil Kumar on integrated resource planning modeling for staff. And he is a program director at Grid Lab, where he brings over 15 years of experience in the energy sector Previously, he was managing director at Intertech, and he has done a lot of work in the energy space with a variety of organizations. And he holds a Master's of Science from North Carolina State University. And joining him for the second part, IRP modeling, deep dive in metrics, methods, and capacity building, is Taylor McNair. He's a senior program manager at GridLab, which he joined in 2018, and he helps lead GridLab's Clean Energy Futures program area. He also has a wealth of experience, and he graduated from Emory with a BBA from the Guizetta, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, business school, and a double major in environmental science. So it's really exciting to have you both here, and we will kick it off with Nikhil. Take it away.
Thank you both, and thanks everybody for joining. So yeah, the way that we thought about presenting this topic, and there's a lot we can talk about in terms of resource planning and sort of the state of the art or best practices. But we've kind of broken this down into a couple of different sessions. I will provide you with sort of the broad strokes of what we are seeing in the industry as we work with other experts doing resource planning across the country. What are some of the steps that utilities have taken and staff have taken to improve modeling, get a sense of the uncertainty that exists, large loads. We'll mention that at least a couple of times. And then, I'll hand it over to Taylor to sort of, talk about how we see folks evaluate the results of the modeling. So with that, I'll get going. I'm sure you've seen slides like this before. There's a big change in the industry, and I'll just give you my perspective in the sense that having worked with a lot of the generators with the utilities over my career, we always wondered where the decisions were being made. I spent a lot of time with traditional steam units, as well as combined cycle and nuclear units. And dispatch was obviously one part of the equation. The other was, we have limited budgets. How do we improve our efficiency? How do we make our power plants more reliable? Was a lot of conversations that I've had over the years with a number of utilities. So I'll give you that perspective. So, we all know there's been a lot of growth, both in terms of demand as well as renewable growth on the grid. And that's had an interesting effect on both the existing fleet as well as just system planning in general. Uh, and reliability risks have sort of not gotten less despite the fact that we've added all this new capacity. And that's partly the nature of the type of new capacity that we are adding to the grid, as well as the fact that we have several aging assets. And if you look at some of the NARUC or EPRI reports, you will realize that as conventional steam units age, and for example, the coal steam fleet is well over 50 years on average in the country, that their reliability falls. And one way to sort of counter that reliability is to spend a lot of money to replace or repair, do major overhauls of these assets, and so that takes resources, and that sometimes is properly modeled, and sometimes it's not. The other thing that we see today, and we'll talk a little bit more in a couple of slides, is the sort of if you don't do this right, you end up with portfolios that might be very fuel biased in some cases, and that can expose you to other kinds of risks. So as we are seeing utilities plan their long-term portfolios, some do it better than others in terms of thinking about these issues with bias on the fuel. Could be looking at resiliency, looking at vulnerabilities that they see, and we'll talk a little bit about each of those points in the coming slides. So this flowchart is from the best practices guide that Synapse and Berkeley Lab did, and I think it's a very important sort of document. And if you don't have the link, I'm sure you can get a hold of these slides and go and take a look. But it captures a really detailed assessment of what is actually happening in terms of the transition on of long-term planning. And my biggest take from that was modern IRPs should, and in some cases are, looking at least regrets planning versus just the least cost planning. Because when we do this from the standpoint of just least cost planning, you tend to sort of focus around a path previously taken, or you kind of already know, you're taking out a lot of the uncertainties that actually exist in reality out of the modeling. And so changing that paradigm to a least regrets planning is critical. Now, as you can see from this flowchart, there's lots of different parts to integrated resource planning. We'll focus more so on sort of the innovation that's come about in alternative ways of reviewing and analyzing portfolios, but a lot of it, the capacity expansion modeling, a little bit around the RA and production cost modeling. So our focus is a little bit limited on this conversation. Now, we'll show you sort of like the universe of modeling tools that are available and are being used by various stakeholders. And in our opinion, and certainly in my opinion, the models have come a long way. When I first started in the industry and looked at some of the modeling techniques we employed, we just didn't have enough horsepower, and with that came even a little bit of complexity in the modeling was a significant constraint for us. Now, what is more important is the modeling tools have come a long way. They're sophisticated. Some have better features than others, but by and large, they all do a pretty good job of actually giving you some kind of a decision nudge. But it really comes down to the modeler themselves. The IRP process can become a black box, especially if you're not transparent with the assumptions that you've taken, the data that you've utilized, or your modeling is so complex that you can't really iterate easily. We recently were working with an expert looking at an IRP, and they couldn't get the models to run in a reasonable amount of time. And so all of that is just a barrier to being able to actually do a good job of analyzing all the uncertainty and all the risks that exists. So the one big thing, if you can take away, is like look for bias, look for any way that you're not being transparent with the information, because that's really the critical issue here. And the other thing that I want to mention was load forecasting. It's sort of like the foundation of the IRP. We can do all kinds of analysis after the fact around this, but if you start with with a not so good initial start with respect to, say, the load forecast, then everything that downstream isn't perfect. And this is a paper from Berkeley Lab. It's a little bit outdated, but I've seen newer iterations of similar analysis. And the point here is that if you see these, most of the time, utilities have over forecasted and certainly inaccurately forecasted their loads. And when you look at the blue lines, which are the actuals, both in terms of the energy as well as the peak demand, except for Sierra Pacific in this example, everybody else kind of missed the mark significantly. Some way more than others. And even if you look at the Sierra Pacific, I mean, the sensitivities are sort of broad, which in a way is good. You've kind of given staff as well as other stakeholders an idea of how much spread there is in terms or the amount of uncertainty that exists when you do long-term planning. So now I wanted to caveat that this is a little bit older. Now, there is, genuinely an increase in demand, whether that be from data centers or from EVs or electrification in general. So yes, there's an increase in load, but still, I would take all forecasts, with a grain of salt. Also, absolutely demand multiple sensitivities around the load forecast. A single load forecast is not the way to go anymore. Um, just to recap, really, so traditionally we've kind of, the goal was to optimize the system. We're looking at the ways, of how to meet energy needs as well as, stress situations, whether that be in peak demand or, some other constraint that exists. Analyzing cost of different resources. We've seen some utilities take efforts into using more up-to-date generator costs, for example. We, and some others often have not. So, if your underlying assumption is that a future generation technology is going to be too inexpensive or too expensive and not reflecting reality, then your results are going to be um, inaccurate. In terms of the objective function, it's a cost minimization historically, but we will talk, and I know Taylor will talk about looking at multiple objectives. And in terms of cost, we were recently reviewing something for a resource plan, and a question came about what about the variable O&M cost? Should that be part of the equation? And absolutely it should be. And you would see things like that not be included in the planning or in the modeling, and there are things to look out for. And then let me get past this, and I'll come back to this chart in a little bit. But yeah, here's not an endorsement of any given vendor, but I just wanted to show you sort of the universe of potential tools that are available. So the ones in sort of the dark blue on the left are sort of commercial tools. The ones in the orangish color are some of the open source options that are available to modelers. Now, there are pros and cons to using one versus the other. With a commercial tool, there's usually a user base because they have been around and utilities have used their services, or in some cases RTOs, and then staff might have been very familiar with these tools. So if you look at the primary focus in terms of the capabilities, all of them provide some sort of economic unit commitment dispatch, capacity expansion modeling capabilities. So resource adequacy might be another module within the paradigm of their solution. So there's a lot of variety of tools that are available. And I'll be cautious, like there will be some tools that you will see and hear more of, and some not so much, but they all do a pretty good job. We did put something around the analyst level just to give you a sense of like what it takes to actually run these models. They have become highly sophisticated, extremely complex to use, and so as you move towards maybe potentially utilizing one or more of these tools, it's important to keep that in mind. Like this requires somebody who either has experience working with these models or has the right background. So I want to make sure that we say that. Okay, and we can come back in terms of Q&A if you want to talk a little bit more about that sort of universe of tools available to you. Now, we were helping some folks sort of decide on, they had in-house tools and they wanted to utilize some of these they wanted to evaluate whether they should procure a commercial tool or an open source tool, and what should be the questions that we wanted to ask. And we just pulled some subsets of those questions. And these are important questions to ask today if you're going to have some modeling capability in-house, or you're evaluating what a given utility might have done in their resource plan. So, how important from a regulatory standpoint is it for you to do uncertainty modeling? And so if the model that they have presented or the methodology that they've presented is very deterministic in nature, then that's sort of a red flag in today's world. Similarly, have you sort of modeled sort of an island with no interaction with an electricity market? And we do see that utilities don't want to expose themselves to too much market. But in a way, the market exists for you to take advantage of. I mean, that's the whole point of that. But are there tools that can sort of, I've given an example of Servum, for example, can co-optimize reliability and market outcomes. And that's, it's worth asking that question. Multi-objective planning, I mentioned. I think Taylor will talk a little bit more in detail around that. And then, how many scenarios have we modeled? More often than not, there's dozens of scenarios that have been modeled. But one quick way of sort of looking at the results is like, is the future projected build of those resources looking similar, even though they've used different sort of scenarios and assumptions in the beginning? And that's a red flag. I mean, that's something for you to question and realize whether, did they do a good job of looking at all the different sensitivities there. Budgets are still constrained. I mean, none of this is free. Some of the commercial tools are a significant resource. But in a way, you have to sort of, you do have support, you have a user base. So there are you should look at the total cost of ownership of some of these modeling tools. The open source is a great way of doing a lot of the modeling without having to worry about some of the licensing fees, but then you need to be able to rely on a community of folks to help you out. And then this is one question that's worth asking. A hybrid workflow does work in some cases. You don't have to pick only a commercial tool or an open source tool. There are possibilities to have a sort of a combination of methodologies, just in the spirit of transparency. So with an open source tool, a lot more stakeholders are able to analyze and utilize some of the modeling. So emerging trends in IRP now, there is a growing trend from multiple utilities to try out some of these best practices that were, that I mentioned early on, that was, published by Synapse in Berkeley, as well as, over the years, they've experimented and tried to bring in some of the state of the art into their modeling. Now, no one utility does all of it. Some of them are doing better than others. So, I'll just give you a few examples here. So, bookend sensitivities, we saw that Sierra Pacific, for example, did this big, broad sensitivity analysis. PNM in the 2023 IRP, had long duration energy storage costs. They had carbon prices. That's just an example of like them trying to do this. So Nebraska Public Power in their 2023 IRP, for example, evaluated like 54 cases just to capture all the uncertainties that they saw. So, utilities are trying to make sure that they properly look at what are the possible scenarios. Now, more recently, Georgia Power in their 2025 IRP used this probabilistic load realization model to capture the uncertainty with load growth. In a way, it was a very simple way of incorporating some of the likelihoods of having new data center load on their system. It was one of the scenarios or sensitivities they ran. It wasn't the one that was finally, the one that was driving it, but it gave them a way of looking at what the possibilities were. PSCO, for example, in their 2024 just transition analysis, they were expecting 62% energy growth by 2031. So it's like in 5 or 6 years. So they had only used like two, excuse me, 2 load forecasts. And after an intervener sort of brought that up, they actually went back and ran a third load forecast. And so that was mostly, sort of they came up with like what I would call, it was an in-between forecast just to get another data point. And that's important, not to just, so the bookends are important, but also accurately looking at sensitivities is important. Yeah, definitely don't model your system as an island. LG&E, Kansas, they made sure that they were modeling the neighboring regions. If I'm not mistaken, they use Servum to do some resource adequacy modeling around that. Pacific Corp, they also do that with transmission limits. So market purchases up to the transmission limit. Idaho Power recently has modeled a new power line, which will give them capacity credit. And it's the 2025 IRP. It can be as much as, I believe, 500 megawatts in the winter. So there is a clear transition to not doing an islanded system modeling. Now, these three, and this is, I believe, my last or second last slide. So these three are more harder to do, not all that common in the sense that they're just complexities even today in the state of the art. So let's start with the first one there, when we're looking at, so bill limits, for example, or hard coding certain outcomes is never, isn't the state of the art, isn't the best practice. So in this, as an example, like Duke Carolina's resource plan, they actually used Encompass and endogenously looked at their capacity expansion and looked at the retirement of their coal plants. But then after the fact, the final retirement dates were, sort of more established based on, what they thought was actually possible. But at least, kudos to them for at least trying to, just do that. Most of the time, if you look at resource plans, there's just a date. This is when we plan to retire the plant. Hasn't been modeled in its true sense. The other thing is about capturing sort of the high fidelity of renewables or energy storage. And this is still, some models are doing better than others. There have been, so this is not universal. We don't have great examples of resource plans that have gone to this kind of, hourly and chronological operation for an entire year to analyzing their analysis, though Taylor is going to talk about like a different approach of doing that. And then, last, I'll mention, accurately looking at resource adequacy in the sense that, when we do load carrying capability, that we don't pick and choose which generation technology we'll do that for. So, for example, Dominion in 2024 IRP, they use PJM's marginal ELCC methodology and applied it to all the resource types, from coal and gas to storage and wind and solar. And then PNM in 2023 did the same thing with the sense that they did ELCCs for renewables, but UCAP for their thermal resources. So there's a little bit of a spread of how folks are doing this. So my last slide, I mean, historically, we've mostly looked at generation planning and sort of left the transmission and DER planning, sort of either excluded it or simplified it. And most of the reasoning was just the complexity and it was just momentum. This is how we did it. This is how we continue to operate. And there are genuine efforts to do more cohesive and more integrated planning, keeping transmission front and center as you're doing a lot of the modeling, looking at demand side management, DERs, and so computationally we've come a long way. So we can do this now, and so to not include some of these aspects in your long-term planning, you're going to come up with a suboptimal result. So That's all I had. I don't know. I think I'm on time.
Nikhil, thank you so much. That was a fantastic, concise synopsis of some really valuable key points. Taylor, we're going to hand things over to you, and I believe you can share your screen.
Awesome. Okay. Can I just get a thumbs up that my slides are up there? Awesome. Let me just get my clock going so I'm looking at time here.
Thank you.
Okay. Cool. Thanks everyone. Thanks Nikhil for kicking us off. Just as a reminder, my name is Taylor McNair. I'm a senior program manager here at GridLab. I guess I should give a little background on who we are, just to give the audience a little sense. GridLab is a national nonprofit, so we exist to provide technical assistance and technical expertise on IRPs, but also all sorts of grid issues. So we sort of work across the system. We work on distribution level analysis, distribution system planning, all the way up to bulk system planning, transmission analysis, et cetera. And in that role, you know, as you probably learned from Nikhil, we have the pleasure of reviewing dozens of IRPs every year from across the country, and we've been doing so for a number of years. And primarily GridLab, you know, we help support intervening parties in resource planning efforts. And so that means, you know, advocates who are intervening, but also consumer advocate organizations, staff entities, other regulatory entities. So kind of get to view the IRP from many different perspectives. And then of course, Nikhil mentioned, you know, some of our sort of broader landscape work in which we're actually, you know, evaluating like best practices in the industry, kind of keeping up with software developments, planning developments, et cetera. So just wanted to give a little perspective on kind of where we're coming from. And so Nikhil did a really nice job of kind of teeing things up in terms of what we're looking at from a planning perspective. I am going to take a few of the points that Nikhil brought up and sort of reinforce them and dive into, you know, to a couple other aspects that we haven't quite touched on yet. But to begin, we're sort of jumping right to the end of the planning process. So I think there's obviously a lot of questions on what the whole IRP planning process leads to, how we sort of evaluate these complexities that emerge from a modeling exercise and from a broader like IRP analysis and stakeholder engagement process and whatnot. And so, you know, the interpretation of results is, you know, can often be one of the most confusing and complicated, potentially contentious, depending on what type of regulatory environment you're in. And so that's, you know, that's sort of the place that I thought we would kick things off. So, you know, a lot of this information, again, is taken from the Synapse LB&L best practices report. We're going to sort of use that as our jumping off point and then dive a little deeper. But, you know, really when it comes to interpreting results, this is all about evaluating the methods and the metrics that are used for interpretation, to understand if there are any biases involved in those. And sort of, you know, best practice number one in this regard is to ensure that your methods and metrics for interpreting results are not biased towards a specific outcome. What I mean by that is, you know, sometimes when we sort of roll up all we've done in an IRP analysis, we put, you know, a certain amount of weight on specific metrics or specific outcomes that sort of have the effect of skewing our IRP results to, you know, potentially to a predetermined outcome. So, you know, it's really important that like in that stakeholder process and kind of in that due diligence process, we are understanding you know, what the methods are for interpreting those results and which metrics we're relying on to, you know, to sort of understand the culmination of a portfolio. Obviously, when we are interpreting results, what we're primarily looking at is the result of key scenarios and sensitivities. So we want to be sure that our portfolio analysis has a sufficient diversity of scenarios and sensitivities to actually provide something meaningful. We review a lot of IRPs that have literally dozens or maybe 100 scenarios and sensitivities. If all of those scenarios are giving you the same result, you're probably not you're probably doing something a little wrong, in the sense that yes, divergence could be interesting, but it's also useful to understand how portfolios diverge and differ, and how that results in different outcomes. Obviously, one of the kind of major ways that we see this portrayed in IRP documents is some sort of scorecard. So, a scorecard can be a useful tool for evaluating and synthesizing all these results. Again, we want to be sure that the metrics to develop those are useful and clear and qualitative. And we want to be sure that the weighting criteria that we assign to those metrics is appropriate and, again, is unbiased. So it's not sort of skewing us towards a specific outcome. I've included a photo here. This is from the Idaho Power IRP released in 2025, this is actually a risk comparison. So it's a scorecard that compares different portfolios on sort of a risk basis, and this is one that we could recommend some improvements to. Again, if you take a look at the Synapse report, there are some good examples of both good and bad scorecards, but really what we want to call out here is low, medium, and high, right? Those are arbitrary values. We don't understand the difference between those metrics. We don't understand what's used to arrive to a low or medium or high conclusion. And then it's hard for us to understand how these different portfolios actually compare to one another, or might compare to a baseline or a preferred portfolio. So, we've seen better representation of, qualitative analysis that helps articulate, again, how some of these key indicators, like your fuel supply or your volatility or siting challenges, could actually result in qualitative impacts. I think the final point I'll mention on this is a cost perspective. So obviously, a lot of our planning is done on a least cost basis, and that revenue requirement or NPV of that portfolio is obviously a key metric. But of course, that's just one metric, and it's sort of already quantified, in and of itself. So I think it's important for us, when we're actually evaluating, on a scorecard basis, that NPV or cost is one consideration, but we're able to sort of incorporate that into a more holistic look at result interpretation. So, sorry, just jumping through, seeing what I have up. When we're interpreting results, one of the I think biggest challenges in this world, and biggest challenges especially from a regulatory perspective or from a regulator perspective, is how do we ensure that we've captured a range of uncertainty, and we've pressure test our utilities' assumptions around their portfolio decisions or their preferred outcomes, right? Because we want to be sure that when we are making, significant investment decisions or significant planning decisions, that we've tried as best as possible to account for those uncertainties. Obviously, you see this a lot when you are reviewing IRPs, because we have sensitivity analysis, right? We have high and low cost, high and low fuel cost assumptions and sensitivities. We have different load forecast assumptions, things like that help us to begin to plan for some of the uncertainty that is out in this world. I think the important thing for us to wrestle with now is that, the world is increasingly more complex, and our planning environment is increasingly more complex. I think Nikhil was alluding to this, but we often used to plan to a very, to to a somewhat simplistic single least cost deterministic value. And while least cost planning is definitely sort of a core principle of long-term resource planning and sort of utility planning in general, it's not the only consideration that we have to evaluate anymore. And so, increasingly our regulators have to consider emissions constraints or other policy objectives, load growth uncertainty, new technologies or future technology risk, which again introduces new kind of untold complexities that we want to be sure are captured and captured robustly in our planning process. And so when we're reviewing IRPs or when we're involved in these processes, it can be difficult to sort of ascertain how comprehensively our utilities have begun to plan for that uncertainty. Because if they haven't, you can probably assume that these portfolios or the preferred portfolio that comes out of the IRP might not be robust. And if things don't go exactly the way that the utility had sort of envisioned in that portfolio planning, you could be in a very different future. So I'm going to tee that up, and we're going to dive a little bit more later on into how this uncertainty plays into practice when we're actually evaluating and modeling. But I do just want to dive into one specific uncertainty, which is sort of the talk of the town these days, which is large load implications. So load growth in general has always been an uncertainty in the planning landscape. Historically, utilities were able and are able to capture some of this uncertainty by conducting different load forecasts. And different utilities, different entities have different levels of sophistication when it comes to forecasting techniques. Obviously, load forecasting itself, is a whole nother topic. Deserves its own entire planning session. But with that said, I think the present moment that we're in, specifically related to large load growth, introduces a particularly nuanced complexity just because of the implications that large loads have on the sort of total resource mix, the cost of your portfolios, the emissions implications, et cetera. And so, without appropriate sensitivity and sort of stochastic risk analysis, those consequences can be significant because we're talking about such large numbers. I think one kind of poignant example that Nikhil alluded to, and we can share some report out on this as well, is the recent Georgia Power IRP. I think Georgia Power made a lot of headlines with its analysis of large loads and just the forecasted load growth. And Georgia Power attempted to wrestle with this uncertainty in their updated IRP, in their 2025 IRP, through sort of a new probabilistic load forecasting technique. And I would point us to some of the intervener testimony in that docket, where folks were commending, I think, the utility for beginning to wrestle with this uncertainty, but also making a number of recommendations for how to improve that. And some of those recommendations amounted to, really are premised in sort of improved uncertainty and risk analysis, ensuring that things like, that the utility is adopting multiple load forecasts, or perhaps parsing out different load segments to understand how that impacts the resource mix and the total cost of the portfolios, so that as a regulator, you can understand, what's driving certain large loads, and if some of that doesn't materialize, here is the implication for ratepayers or for other consumers or other stakeholders, and really understanding who's driving those changes and what the potential off ramps are in case some of that load doesn't materialize. So there are a number of recommendations around around, modifying your forecast or developing different forecasts based on the probabilities that load does materialize or does not, or if some of that load drops off or does not ramp as high as the ramping assumptions suggest. And again, that is just sort of one component of sensitivity analysis that then feeds into the rest of the IRP, the rest of the planning process, where you can sort of conduct additional due diligence on how that's impacting the resource mix and the portfolios, and sort of what the overall implications are there. So what does this mean for regulators? Nikhil alluded to this. I'm just going to kind of jump through the options from a modeling perspective. Obviously, staff and commissions could bring some of this capability in-house to do their own modeling. That obviously can be time and resource intensive. You can contract that out to outside experts. The one I'm going to focus on, though, which is obviously a favorite of ours, is intervener modeling. So many commissions over the years have introduced intervener access to modeling and to licenses in particular. And our experience is that this access to the modeling tools by intervening parties and by sort of outside parties has really helped enhance the regulatory process by introducing new methodologies, new scenarios, new analysis techniques to help begin to answer and wrestle with some of these uncertainty and risk questions. Sometimes that intervener modeling can be done with the commercial software. Sometimes it can be conducted with open source modeling, as Nikhil alluded to. And so, I think there's many different opportunities, and we have many examples of enabling this access from a regulator perspective, which we can talk more about in the discussion period. And then I would be remiss if I didn't get the opportunity to flag, more explicitly some of the innovative modeling approaches that GridLab has helped to develop and is beginning to socialize in our resource planning work. And these are really innovative modeling techniques for dealing with uncertainty in a world where we are balancing competing priorities, or maybe different constraints that could come in front of utilities or in front of their regulators. And this work is really about demonstrating how policymakers can use this approach to evaluate a suite of portfolios for reliability and cost and other considerations, while minimizing the intensity and the resources required to review and analyze. Because we know as regulators, you have a lot to look at in IRP documents. You can't possibly, run thousands of your own scenarios. So we're trying to develop techniques where you can rapidly iterate and understand what risk is inherent in some of those portfolios, what uncertainty exists, and how you can dig deeper into some of those. This is just a snapshot from one of those tools that we've highlighted, which is from a paper on our website called Rethinking the Role of Capacity Expansion Modeling. This is basically an approach where we sort of move past the capacity expansion approach and focused on the production cost component of the analysis, where we're able to rapidly develop, thousands of portfolio samples. So on the top chart, you're seeing 1,500 different portfolio samples of, based on the same sort of inputs and assumptions of a kind of make-believe service territory. And then the ability to kind of dive deeper into the 30 least cost portfolios that you might want to focus on and understand how the costs are breaking down differently. So a lot more to say about this. This is just kind of a sneak peek at some kind of innovative approaches that we're thinking about to be able to dive in and iterate a little faster on your sensitivity and uncertainty analysis to help, get at the sort of interpretation of those results. And then finally, just my kind of final two slides are just sort of a highlight and quick discussion on sort of the transparency and capacity building components of the IRP process. Obviously, a lot of ink has been spilled on the importance of data transparency and sort of access to data, modeling files, modeling inputs, modeling outputs, et cetera, which we think is really important because those are sort of the fundamental drivers of eventual outcomes. And as Nikhil was mentioning earlier, models are only black box because of what's in them. And if you're able to get a clear understanding and clear grasp of those assumptions and sort of driving features, you can get much better insight into your outputs, your metrics, and your interpretation of those results. So finally, these are just a few of the questions that we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail when we get to the discussion component. But it's really, all of this is sort of coming down to like, do we have the tools at our disposal to evaluate uncertainty? Do we need new tools? Do our utilities have the capabilities, or are they effectively implementing, risk and uncertainty analysis to give us good results and good reporting metrics? How can we kind of rapidly iterate through portfolio analysis to understand what utilities are proposing in their IRPs and help to mitigate some of that risk? And then how can we begin to include multi-objective planning, so we're moving sort of beyond least cost and actually considering the full suite of potential impacts of those portfolios to understand how it's sort of transforming the broader IRP landscape. So lots of questions left to chew on. I think I will leave it there because I am at time and happy to take any questions.